All right, so with that, we'll move on to our next agenda item for the day, and I'll give you a brief introduction to the presentations and to the speakers. I want to start out with a somewhat provocative statement, making use of Dr. Bob Harrington's presence in the audience and using him as the trialist among us. Evidence-based medicine has long worshipped at the altar of randomized clinical trials, and probably for good reason. The well-done trial can give you accurate and precise estimates of drug effectiveness and safety, and we've had a long time to figure out the kinks in the system. But over the past decade or so, there seem to be two dueling philosophies that have emerged. There are the trialists who say, well, if it's not randomized, is it even worth it? I'm poking fun at you, Dr. Harrington, I don't mean that, but the idea that that's the only way to do things, and they have plenty of evidence from the pandemic showing us where real world evidence led us astray. And then there's the alternative philosophy that says, well, these trials enroll highly select patients, and so we have estimates of average treatment effect that are highly accurate, precise, and irrelevant to the patient in front of us. This is particularly problematic for clinical trials where approval processes outside the US have been fairly erratic. As an influential editorialist once wrote, the clinical trials outside for devices outside the US seem to read like, we randomized 25 patients and we liked it. Now, how do we, of course, this is a very simplistic view of the world, that all RCTs are good or all real world evidence is bad. And how do we get these two fields to work together to provide a more complete picture of the evidence to the benefit of our patients? And so we have now for you 4 presentations where speakers, experts in their fields, are going to talk about how real world evidence can help either when trials are not available, when they're insufficient or don't provide the complete picture, or we have the complete picture pre-approval, but what can we learn after the device is already on the market? So 4 speakers, about an hour and a half, and here are the ground rules. Miguel has put me to the task of making sure everybody finishes in 20 minutes. We'll have time for a couple of questions. And again, a reminder, any questions that we don't get to, we'll have time in the afternoon at the panel discussion. So with that, I'll introduce our first speaker, Dr. Eric Secemsky. I promised I'd pronounce his name right. Is our section head of interventional cardiology and vascular research at the Smith Center and the director of vascular intervention at Beth Israel Deaconess. Among his many achievements, he's an assistant professor at HMS, is the fact that he has played a really important role in the FDA's evaluation of safety of vascular devices. And here he is to talk to us about what real world evidence can show us when trials are not available.
Great, thank you. It's rare when my name is pronounced correctly, so but my friend should get it right. And Miguel, I got my clock up here, so. Great, so I'm going to give an example of where we were left with a safety concern for a device and a paucity of evidence to guide us in how to move forward. And so this was a study we did in partnership with the FDA and the CDRH group in particular. We called it the SAFE AAA study. These are my disclosures. We did receive funding from the FDA as part of this project. So we have a mixed room here, and I'm just going to step back for a moment to lay out the conundrum that we faced on the clinical side. So the area of interest here is abdominal aortic aneurysms. And so this is an outpouching, or we call it dilation of the aorta, our major vessel in our abdomen, that occurs in a fairly frequent prevalence among our US population and worldwide. So you can see really this is US rates, but for patients above the age of 60, anywhere between 1% and 3% will develop in an aneurysm. Now, these aneurysms grow at different rates. Some grow quickly, some grow more slowly, but we know that when they do accelerate in growth and meet a certain size threshold, that they're at risk of rupturing suddenly, and that's associated with a death as high as 80%. That makes it the 10th most common cause of mortality among the general population and 2% of all deaths. Now, how do we treat abdominal aortic aneurysm in the US? Well, this has really evolved over the last 2 decades. Traditionally, this was a very morbid, highly fatal surgical treatment. We had to actually open up the abdomen, clamp a major vessel, try to either line or remove the aneurysmal segment and insert a new graft. But over the last 2 decades, we've seen, as in many of our cardiovascular devices, an evolution of percutaneous approaches for treating these aneurysms. I'll show you an example of this in a moment, but these devices, and we call them EVAR grafts, EVAR, endovascular aneurysm repair, go typically through a groin approach and is able to line the aneurysm to keep flow from flowing into the aneurysm and causing rupture. Now, after the introduction of these grafts in the early 2000s, we've seen a remarkable uptick in terms of its use. We're now in the US alone, more than 80% of aneurysms treated with an endovascular approach versus the traditional open surgical approach. And this has many implications, including how do surgeons today train to do open surgery if they're only performing endovascular care? When these were approved, I think that the mindset was this was going to be a select population, primarily older patients who didn't qualify for surgery, and also probably with a limited prognosis. And as such, trials to get these devices onto the market were limited in terms of the population they covered, as well as the amount of time they followed patients. Again, most of these went out only through around 5 years, allowing for a good assessment of risk for people who have a more guarded prognosis, but less understanding of what happens over the long term of these devices. So what are we going to talk about today is really the concern of endoleak. And again, I'm not going to get too technical here, but this is an important part of what these devices do is they seal the aneurysm, as you can see in this kind of pink bubble here on the figure on the right. And you want to avoid blood flowing into the aneurysm that can cause it to grow and rupture. Now, a successful seal allows the aneurysm to either stabilize or shrink. But we found that about a quarter of the population, when these grafts are placed, there's still residual flow moving into that sac. And so this has required many recurrent interventions to treat these type of different endoleaks. And the treatment really depends on the type and location. Again, this figure is not to get into those details, but just to demonstrate the concerns that have occurred after approval of these devices. And the one that we're going to focus on is for a specific stent graft, a specific EVAR graft with a specific mode of failure. So this EVAR graft was approved. It's called a unibody device. And it had a different design than all other grafts approved. We've had about a dozen of these on the market. But this whole family of devices, and there's been several iterations, had a unique design where instead of the fabric being on the inside of the graft, it actually was on the outside of the graft. Now, this had some benefits in terms of how it was placed and anchored in the body, but it also, early in its approval, started to show some risks that were occurring with this. This include billowing or outpouching of the fabric, leaking of the fabric, and separation of the compartments associated with it. And so you can see here on this radiograph on the right is a malplace, the separation of two components of that graft that can again cause adverse events, including rupture and death. Now, there's many postulations of why this occurred, but these devices have undergone several iterations on the market, and I'll show you, with different corrections, whether strengthening the fabric, improving the overlap of components, and trying to reduce the overall risk of these endoleaks and eventual rupture. However, we've never really had strong evidence that these corrective measures have resulted in reductions in these endoleaks and rupture events that we're concerned about. And again, as this was a very quickly moving field, many devices coming on the market and the growth of these devices being used, we've been left with understanding what are the real population risks associated with these devices and what are the comparative risks between this specific device we'll be talking about and alternative competitive devices. So what has come of this? Well, in the last several years, we've seen, again, that this specific device, and we're going to call it the unibody device, there's some brand names here, but this is the generic name, has really shown early failure rates compared to competitive and comparative devices. Now, we know that these devices can be used interchangeably with other devices, so there are treatment options available for the general patient, but some providers or operators choose this device, so and that tends to be their preference. But we know that older data have demonstrated that the devices can frequently are failing. We don't have as much data on the more newer devices that remain contemporarily on the market today. And this is just one glimpse of some real world evidence that started to really cannibalize this conversation. You can see here in this Kaplan-Meier figure on the right, these are three different types of grafts. In red is an older iteration of the unibody graft, blue is the newer iteration, and green is the newest, only one that's on the market today. And in very limited data, you can see I square here at the bottom, the green, there are a few devices that were in this study, but we're showing a failure rate that was much greater than those, even compared to their partner devices that had known failures associated with them. So what's unique about this study? Well, the unique opportunity here is that very infrequently can we look at a large scale database like an insurance database and actually find a brand of a specific device. Typically, we're able to identify cardiovascular device implant, but very rarely can we actually find the specific device that we're interested in. Well, in this situation, there was actually a unique CPT code that only captured these type of grafts, the unibody grafts. And again, these are the different brand names that have come out over time. But by able to understand what grafts were being placed, we now were positioned to compare how these performed with other competitive grafts that did not have this unique design, as well as leverage how these devices were launched into the market about which specific type of graft what are we studying in each study period of this unique performance here. So that brings us to the objective of the SAFE AAA study. So again, we are left in the context of a graft that had been known to have some failure rates, but wasn't clearly captured, a contemporary graft that still had concerns for ongoing risk, and a lack of long-term data sources to understand how large of an influence this is at the population level and how much this differed compared to competitive devices. So in the SAFE AAA study, we looked at a very important outcome that included mortality and complications related to the graft using a Medicare fee-for-service claims data population. So we did, and then the secondary objectives here were to look at those individual endpoints, but also to understand if we look throughout the lifeline of this unibody graft, whether at different periods did these risks persist, and really most importantly in the contemporary period where we have a graft still in the market, are these concerns still relevant? So this was a pre-specified analysis, and we've done a couple of these now with the Food and Drug Administration, where we have a very systematic way in terms of ensuring the integrity of this study. So we do all of these as pre-specified analyses. Some of these we've actually published our methods paper, which is unique for an observational study. We designed this specifically with feedback from the FDA and the CDRH group in particular. And we looked at the Medicare fee-for-service population because this gave us both a large-scale group of patients. The majority of patients who have abdominal aortic aneurysms are above the age of 65. So we captured a very relevant population, and we're able to get a very longitudinal look at these devices as well as outcomes. We compared this unique unibody device versus competitive devices using that CPT code I laid out. And we were able to identify really important endpoints that had clear definitions and define ways to identify them in claims data, which I'll outline in a moment. So in terms of our methodology, so typically we use inverse probability weighting for the comparative studies that we do in these type of FDA regulatory performance studies. So in this case, if you're not familiar, inverse probability weighting uses the propensity score to apply weights to two different populations to create balance in characteristics that are measured between the two. When we do this in two data sets. So as a part of the FDA regulatory process, we have a weighted data set that's completely blind to the outcome. So we have no idea what will happen to these patients. Once weighting is performed and completed, we then link it back into the outcome data set. We typically have done this as a non-inferiority design. We expect this safety of this device to be similar to that of all competitive devices on the market. So we pre-specify a non-inferiority margin, which is 5% for this situation. When we do the analytic approaches here, it's particular for the Medicare population. We want to make sure that we account for the competing risk of death as a typical competing risk for this population. So we use typically cumulative incidence functions for non-death related outcomes, Kaplan-Meier estimates for death-related outcomes, and then we look at both the sub-distribution and cost-specific hazards when we do our Cox regression. Now, the sensitivity analysis I'm going to present here, there were many. So again, we had interest in understanding how each of these unique iterations of the unibody graft had different failure rates, but most importantly, again, was focusing on what was available in the market today. So in this presentation, you'll see here that we'll present period 6, which is a part of the period of when the most contemporary device that remains on the market was available, and represent about 90% of that newest iteration graft called AFX2. So, and then finally, we always do some assessment for unmeasured confounding. In this study, we did falsification endpoints, so negative controls where we would expect these endpoints to not differ between the two populations. And for this, we landmark them at 30 days to avoid peri-procedural events. We look at hospitalized stroke, congestive heart failure, and pneumonia. So what did we find in the SAFE AAA study? So we had 103,000 patients who were screened and 87,000 patients that met criteria for inclusion in the analysis. That left us with about 14% of patients who were treated with this unique unibody device versus 86% of patients treated with competitive grafts. I think this slide really is important. So when we look, the first thing that I look at when we look at these comparative analyses is how similar are the populations between those treated with the device and the alternative device. This is called a love plot. So you'll see in red here is all the differences and characteristics before we applied the propensity score based weights. And then in blue is the after weighting. And that black line you see there represents the 10% margin, which we usually consider residual imbalances. So you can see really importantly here that there are 5 diamonds on the right side of black at the top there. That means there was only a few characteristics that actually differed between the 2 populations treated with this device, suggesting that many patients were being treated depending on where they are or who the operator was or whoever, the region they were treated at, but they were typically being treated interchangeably between the devices where we weren't concerned that treatment selection bias was a big determination of how patients received their graft. After waiting, there was no imbalances that persisted. Jumping to the outcomes, this is the cumulative incidence curves after waiting. And blue here is for unibody grafts, and for red here is non-unibody grafts. And again, this captures the entire lifeline of these unibody grafts, so throughout all the different iterations. We had a maximum follow time of 8.5 years, median follow time of 3.4 years. And really nicely, we demonstrated what we kind of already suggested in the literature, was that there was early failure rates as well as late failure rates or occurrences happening with these grafts. You can see right after about year 1 to year 2, these curves start to separate, and there really was an emergence of risk associated with these unibody grafts that continue to separate with time. When you look at the risk didn't plateau at 1, 2, or 3 years, but actually persisted and started to plateau at 4 to 5 years. And you can see in this plot here of the instantaneous hazard ratios over time, showing again that the risk really didn't stop accumulating until 4 to 5 years. There was still risk ongoing, but that's when we knew that the risk related to these devices were accumulating over time and not just isolated to an early period. And when you look at the individual endpoints, and this is very important for the clinician, it wasn't just one failure mechanism that was happening, whether it was the need to reline, we call it the graft, or open repair the graft. We saw that there were many different failure mechanisms happening with these grafts, as well as an increased risk of all-cause mortality. So really, it was critical that we had the granularity to show these components of the outcome, because each of them are related to different failure mechanisms to the graft. Falsification endpoints, heart failure, pneumonia, and stroke, there was really no difference, suggesting again that our base population was rather undifferentiated in terms of the selection of treatment for the EVAR graft. So probably the most critical part of this is really what happens to patients right now where this graft is available to be implanted in 2023. So we had 24,000 patients treated in the most contemporary period. This period is when we knew that the majority of the grafts being placed in the US was the current market available device AFX2. 12.4% had been treated with these devices, and we now had follow-up data about through 4 years. And you can see here again in blue, a little more delayed in terms of when these curves separate, but still signs that even with all those corrective measures to the grafts, relaunching new graft, there's still a sign that there is probably something unique about this graft that is still failing and failing at a higher risk compared to patients treated with alternative grafts that have different designs. And again, when you go back to those individual endpoints, a lot of the mechanistic reasons why this failed are captured in these endpoints, including the need, what we call relining or putting another graft within the prior graft. So I think this really was a critical moment where we felt that the data, which was the largest data set available in the US at this point, suggested that even with all these corrective measures, that the risk with these devices persist, and we can quantify these nicely in the SAFE AAA study. Now, when you plot out how older grafts that we knew failed and newer grafts are starting to look, you can see here that the trend is starting to kind of follow each other. So again, period 1 and period 2 are older grafts, newer grafts, and we have limited data for period 2 right now up through just under 4 years. For period 1, we have a much longer. You can see the general trend and the risks estimates associated with these grafts are starting to follow the same pattern. So strengths and limitations of this example of using real-world evidence to answer a safety concern for a specific cardiovascular device. Well, the strengths, again, as I captured, is the majority of patients with abdominal aortic aneurysms are treated in the US under Medicare insurance. So we have a large representative cohort. We had longitudinal follow-up, and we really do not suffer often from missing data in Medicare, especially because Medicare does not want to pay for people who died and they don't know they died. So they have a very good ascertainment of mortality data. And we had some very nice granular endpoints that we think are high fidelity because they're linked to reimbursement. There's always limitations, and here we do not have anatomical or procedural details that might understand a little bit more about the device failures. And also, we need more longitudinal follow-up for the more contemporary time periods. So in conclusion, as we presented this at an advisory panel for the FDA in November of 2021, among Medicare beneficiaries treated with an endovascular approach between 2011 and 17, we saw that really these unibody devices failed to meet non-inferiority of this endpoint. And we really felt that this was robust to confounding, both from treatment selection bias as well as baseline differences, and that the most concerning finding is that the secondary endpoints persisted in a more contemporary time period with a newer, currently available endograft. Again, this was used as part of the FDA Advisory Panel, and after the panel and some other deliberations and data, there has been a safety communication alerting healthcare providers to avoid this graft if possible, and also a mandate for the company to collect a longer real-world data set to understand and further quantify the risk associated with their newest iteration of their graft. And the paper that came out of this was just published with partners from the FDA in circulation just last month. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present to them.
Questions from the audience?
What kind of pushback? Actually, can you put your mic on? And we are going to ask the speakers to repeat the questions because not everyone can hear this online. Here is kind of pushback.
So the question is, what kind of pushback did I get from the company? I think you always have to have a little bit of thick skin when you do these analyses, and I think the key to our center is to be true to the data and what the conclusions are. And so we definitely got pushback. I think that this is a area, just like other cardiovascular devices, where there are US physicians who have a strong belief in the device, and there are, non-believers in the device. And so we had a very interesting and at times intense call during the advisory meeting where members of the company and then their physician supporters were on. But overall, I think that it was pretty clear that this device had been failing. And unfortunately, the corrective actions were a little delayed, but I think by the time where this was presented to the public in the forum that we discussed it in, that there was more focus on, is the current device a remaining issue and how do we address that versus what had happened in the past. But great question, and definitely always an issue.
All right, guys, I'll play on a roll. So, if I do my math right, over about 8 years, there's about 14,000 patients a year who get one of these things. Who's at fault for not randomizing? Is it the physicians who do the procedure? Is it the companies who'd rather not see it exposed to randomization? Who can we blame here? Or are we all told in this?
So I'll repeat the question. The question was, there were several years, 7, 8 years of data showing harm here. Why wasn't randomization or another option to evaluate the safety of these devices launched during this timeline? It's a really important question. I think the post-market safety trials, and I mean, we have Dr. Mori here who ran the DAP study that came out of this equivalent of the 2000s. Is a big undertaking for approved devices for how patients are treated in the US, but I think they were critical. I think in this case, there was some delays, and I don't want to speak for our regulatory officers here, but delays in terms of how this was addressed and then maybe some of the transparency behind it. But I think, I think that is a very suitable question. And I think the nice part about what we're able to do with the real world evidence is ideally in parallel or separately from a randomized trial show what early glimpses of what we think the potential harm signal are, whereas it will take years, as you know, for the trial to result. So I don't know if yeah, Bren.
So
Dr. Harrington raises a critical point where I would take a step back, which is saying, first of all, what is the question that we really want to answer? The question that we really want to answer is, over an extended length of time, can we pick up a critical event that has a very low incidence rate? And certainly an RCT can do that, but with a sample size that becomes very large and does not necessarily allow for device iteration. So there are other mechanisms that are being discussed here. Their veracity needs to be better delineated, but I think the positive thing that has come out of this experience is that there's a push by the agency to develop a tighter post-market surveillance system for this particular area along the lines, somewhat along the lines that Secemsky has outlined, and we can discuss further in the panel section.
Wonderful. Dr. Kirsten.
Yeah, a quick question. So you started off with your first slide and you showed early on 20,000 open, 20,000 first taking spaces. And then over time, the total number actually went down. I started to think, what's changed in the world? Better, less smoking, perhaps, better control hypertension. Are the methods, are they going to be impacted by the changing background milieu or hopefully overall, public health and medical interventions for that?
Yeah, it's a great question and good pickup. I think that although there might be variations in the frequency of these procedures, there hasn't really been a breakthrough in terms of how we treat aortic aneurysms. So some of that may be fluctuations in just the US population and risk factors, but
blood pressure, pay better, maybe that
yeah, it's an important question. And I think again, having the time, the length of follow-up and also the study period length is ideal for capturing these type of changes in the population that would be missed if we only looked at a 2-year period of patients treated later on. So I think it's an important point and speaks a little bit to having that long-term leadway for this study to capture them.